Greetings, my name is JC,
And I'm Ian.
and this is the Gamer's Gaiden. And this week we're going to be going over some of the early video games in the horror genre.
Yeah, we thought it would be kind of neat to look back at some of the classics
Mm-hmm.
and things that people didn't necessarily know. As I'm sure you guys have noticed, we haven't been releasing content as frequently as we had previously.
Yeah.
It's been a pretty challenging month for the pair of us, and we're trying to make a comeback now and get things sorted out. We do have a couple videos in store for the month of October
Yeah.
that are a little bit special.
Yeah. To go along with kind of like a horror theme.
Yeah, we're going to be doing a retrospective on Castlevania. And then we thought for today it would just be kind of neat to hit on a few of the things that were, I guess, kind of the early stages of horror, the beginnings of it, and things that you actually see, or elements you see transition, I should say, into kind of stuff that we still play now.
Yeah.
But before that, JC, what have you been playing this week?
So as I mentioned previously, I've been working on the League of Legends Worlds Quest since the Worlds are now in session.
How's the quest going for you?
Pretty good. I think I'm almost done. So they originally only released a handful of quests, like 6 or 8 of them, which was like complete games and get more points if you win or less points if you lose. And then after a week on the week before Worlds actually started, they added in a bunch of more quests, which were more specific and like take out a certain number of towers, do
A little bit
certain
more
amount of-
fun.
Yeah, a little bit more fun. Rather than just playing a bunch of games.
Nice.
So I've hammered through all of those quests except for the last quest of the 200 of 200. I think at 178 of 200 for
Wow.
the final collection of like points for playing games, and plowed through the extra ones that they threw in there, that I've gotten so far. So
Nice.
I think maybe they might throw in some fresh ones every week. We'll see. Like it just started over this past weekend, so yeah, we'll see how that goes. But it's been playing quite a bit of that with some friends and trying to get in some flex games to maybe increase flex elo with some people. We're playing some 5v5s and things like that with a handful of people that we know on our Discord server.
Nice.
And yeah, just having fun playing that. And yourself, Ian?
I've been further exploring Xbox Game Pass.
Cool.
Yeah, I definitely talk about it often. It's I think right now, when I first got it, it was $2 for 2 months.
Okay.
And I think at the moment it's $1 for 1 month.
Right.
Which, why not, right? I think they've done a really good job of like games as a subscription service.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, any of their first party titles are available on day one.
Right. Which is pretty impressive because they don't do that for the PlayStation Now service, correct?
No,
It's
as far as I
older
know,
games, I believe.
it's quite a few older games, and they stream it as well, whereas this is actually downloaded straight onto your system.
Right.
You do need an internet connection so they can validate your subscription.
Right.
So, I mean, you still have to be online,
Mm-hmm.
but at least you don't have to worry about streaming it.
Right.
Yeah, but so I've gotten my hands on quite a few things that I wanted to play.
Mm-hmm.
I just hadn't had a chance to, and didn't necessarily want to take the risk on, I guess, buying it and then hating it.
Right.
But yeah, so a lot of stuff that was like Xbox exclusive, like Void Bastards,
Mm-hmm.
which is like it's a cell shaded shooter, but also a roguelike as well. It kind of reminds me of it reminds me a bit of FTL, if FTL was a shooter.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
So you're in space, going from like traveling from like derelict vessel to derelict vessel that do have enemies on them.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the ultimate purpose of the game is to get basically like a machine to make yourself a citizen card
Okay.
so that you can get back, reintegrate yourself into normal society.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, as you're traveling from ship to ship, collecting different parts and different items, you have to always be grabbing fuel to keep the ship moving, and sandwiches to keep yourself fed. So it's a lot of fun. When you die, it's just random new body, but the new body might have different, I guess, modifiers.
Oh, okay.
The last one I had was tall.
Right.
So it was noticeably taller. I found I actually had to crouch most of the time so I could, like, kind of shoot normally at enemies.
Right.
I was substantially taller. I've also had a smoker who coughed quite a bit, and I found their oxygen level on their suits tended to decrease significantly faster than a normal.
Oh, okay, because they're breathing more heavily and stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's a lot of neat little elements that do incorporate into the gameplay.
Interesting.
So that's been a lot of fun. I spent a little bit of time with Outer Wilds, which is the again another, I guess, almost like Groundhog Day,
Right.
where you keep reliving the same day over and over again.
Yeah.
And
I've heard a little bit about that game. It sounded kind of interesting.
yeah, you launch your ship, you land it, you explore. If you die, you just wake up on launch day again, and you go back, launch again, and just explore the solar system. It's been quite a bit of fun. I don't know if I would buy it.
Right.
Like, I don't think
It's kind of good for, like, just a little bit of your time.
I spent about 2 hours with it, and I think I was happy with that 2 hours.
Oh, okay.
I wouldn't push more. But the big one that I played was Slay the Spire.
Okay.
Which I'd been looking at for a long time, and I enjoyed it enough that I went and bought it on the Switch. So yeah, no, it's perfect, and I think it's perfect on the Switch because it's that.
That's just a small deck building card game.
Yeah. Well, again,
It'd
with
probably
the
work on your cell phone too.
probably.
Yeah.
I don't see any reason why I wouldn't. Yeah, it's just a short little deck builder. You go as far as you can, and when you die, that's it. Your run is over.
Yeah,
So-
I wouldn't be surprised if, because it's available on the major PC platforms and the console platforms, and I wouldn't be surprised if that game was released on
It would be perfect.
on like iOS and Android.
It's just perfect. It suits it perfectly. That's why I think it's great on the Switch,
Right.
because it's that like 3 minutes of gameplay and satisfying gameplay. So I'm still exploring Game Pass. I've still got a bunch of stuff that I've downloaded that I haven't had a chance to actually play yet.
Right.
But yeah, I'm just gonna
Just kind of
keep going. I mean, for
keep
the
going till your
$2 that I've
subscription
spent was well spent. So
it's the most use you've gotten out of the Xbox so far.
it's probably the most use I've gotten out of the Xbox, and well, since I initially bought it, because it did have some great games at launch.
Right.
That's another topic. But yeah. So with that, let's move on to some super old horror games.
Yeah. Early examples and kind of some influences into the genre, because a lot of these games that we're going to go over kind of they're older and they have simpler game loops and mechanics, but it's kind of interesting because if you really look into them, they kind of were inspirational to future games that have a lot more complex game design in them, and kind of see and saw inspiration into some of these early examples of these horror games, as we kind of now have our survival horror and adventure style games and stuff like that as well, that are macro horror based and stuff like that. But our first game is kind of an interesting story.
This is probably my favorite on the list, even though I've never actually played it.
Right.
It is Shark Jaws, which was made by Atari.
Yeah. And
Under a subsidiary to kind of shield themselves from any potential lawsuits. So they initially wanted to make this as a licensed Jaws game. This came out in arcades in 1975. And it's technically the first movie tie-in game.
Right.
Yeah, if you see the arcade cab, the word shark is printed very tiny.
Yeah, it's
right next to these
micro, like,
giant uppercase jaws. So it you will see the jaws before you notice the shark. And if
Yeah.
you saw it in an arcade, you'd probably think like you'd probably see it as Jaws, not
Especially at the
anything
time, you're
else.
like, oh, cool, a Jaws game. Let's play that. Yeah.
And the gameplay loop is very similar to what you'd expect. Kind of, you swim around collecting small fish
Mm-hmm.
while trying to avoid the giant, uh, I guess, unlicensed great white shark swimming around.
Yeah. It's Jaws.
It's an unlicensed great white shark.
Fair enough. As far as Universal is concerned, it's an unlicensed great white shark. Yeah, for sure.
That's true because we couldn't find any record of Universal actually like taking them to court over it.
Yeah.
And it did fairly well too. They sold about 2,000 machines,
Mm-hmm.
which, I mean, for Atari in America at that point, that's
Yeah, I think those are pretty good numbers.
Yeah.
Because like games would be made fairly quickly. There'd be a few of them a year from a company, and then you like you'd be selling a few thousand or whatever, and
well, yeah, because
moving on to the
you're
next
only
one.
selling arcade cabs, right? Like, there's
Right.
no, it's not like this is really for
Yeah.
home consumption. This
But
is
if you look it up, you can find gameplay videos of it, and it's kind of interesting because you're basically collecting fish
yeah,
and ignoring the shark.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't. We will look at gameplay footage. Like I said, we don't have access to the cab, and
I
we
mean,
didn't
I
bring it
would
up in MAME,
I would
but,
for sure buy this if I was gonna own an arcade
one
cabinet.
arcade game. Yeah.
This was the one I would own.
Cool. Yeah, it's got a pretty interesting history and story behind it for sure. But yeah, you just continue to collect a fish, move on to the next level, collect a fish, move on to the next level, and eventually the shark will potentially eat you. And the fish moves around like Pong too, because I found that interesting because the fish bounces on the four edges of the screen just like Pong basically, and the shark sort of. I'm not sure if it's random or if he kind of semi goes towards you, but.
He has a similar mechanic too, but he also can pass through the screen.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you can go like around the screen as if it were like a sphere or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of cool. What I think the most interesting about it, other than the weird like legal stuff,
Mm-hmm.
is that when you compare this like gameplay loop
Mm-hmm.
to the Jaws released in '87 on the NES,
Right.
this is very similar.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the NES Jaws does have some like added features and a little bit more complexity, but ultimately, I mean, you're a little diver swimming around collecting shells and avoiding the great white sharks.
Yeah, it's definitely influenced by it for sure.
Oh,
And,
100%.
yeah. And you might be wondering, like, how is this a horror game? It's like, well, whenever Jaws first came out, it was kind of like a thriller horror.
It was
suspense.
probably I would say one of the biggest horror movies of the time. I mean,
Yeah.
this kept people off the beaches, scared people out of the water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's kind of came to be before your traditional like Western horror and stuff like that, where like Friday the 13th movies and stuff like that were happening and stuff. So
And I mean, I don't want to get super into the movie itself,
Yeah,
but I mean, it was kind of a defining thing in horror. I mean, they really held off on the monster. You didn't see that for the longest time, and it was just elements of that terror, right? And I think, I mean, the gameplay for 75, I think they capture that well enough. You know, you've got that looming figure chasing you about, and it was scary enough. I mean, you go back that far, there's not a lot that's visually going to be super terrifying, but I guess that kind of segues really good into our next one, because that's actually a little bit further back than this.
yeah, so Hunt the Wumpus from 1973, which is available on various different PCs, and this game was re-released and produced on like later PCs as well in the early 80s. But it's a text-based, the original version of it anyway, it was a text-based survival horror game. And basically it includes 20 caves that are interconnected with each other, and they're connected, each cave has 3 points. It's uses the dodecahedron layout basically. I'll put an image of what a decadedron looks like up here so you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, basically the objective is you're moving around in these caves and you're basically trying to hunt and kill the Wumpus. And you can shoot or move. And whenever you move, you can move into one of the three connected rooms, and they all connect together. And basically, if you think you know where it is, you can fire one of your 5 arrows up to 5 rooms away, basically, or caves. And then if you hit the Wumpus, you kill it and win the game. And if you don't, then you can continue going on. But then there's some kind of things that kind of hinder your progress as you kind of go forward. For example, you can accidentally shoot yourself with an arrow because it can kind of like loop around in the caves.
Yeah, because you decide how many caves you want it to go forward, but because of the shape, because it's not a grid,
Yeah.
which is, I think, super interesting, because a lot of the games at the time were grid based,
Yeah,
and the designer was just like, nah, grids are boring. Like, why don't we make something that's a little bit more interesting?
Yeah.
So he went with the dodecahedron because it's an odd shape,
Yeah.
and you could potentially loop that shot back to yourself.
Right. But yeah, it's got multiple creatures as well. There's or obstacles, I should say. One is if you feel a draft, there's pit ahead of you, and you can fall into it and die. The Wumpus can eat you. You can shoot yourself with an arrow, and if you meet up with bats, you hear the bats, and if you move up to them, basically they can randomly move you into a different room. So you don't necessarily know where you are. So you'll have to either write down like what room you're in by like graph paper or paper in front of you.
It's a lot of note taking, really,
Yeah.
because all it tells you is you're in room like 1. And it's room 1 is connected to like 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah.
And then when you move into one of those rooms, you might get a prompt like you smell a wampus, you feel a draft, you hear bats.
Yeah.
Like, not you hear bats to the left, you smell a wampus on the right side. It's just this is the input that we're giving you. There's obviously like bats, a cave or a pit, or the wampus nearby.
But it's one of the connections, right?
Yeah,
and the Wampus is moving too, so he might come into your square and then eat you. And I just found this interesting because it's cited as an influences a lot of the early survival horror games because you don't necessarily know where you're going or what's ahead of you, and you're moving around in this area basically of this cave system, and it's neat because like a lot of the games back then were just like grid based because in a computer you have like an array which would just basically be a table of information and you'd store all the rooms in that table. And this kind of changed the game a little bit and thought outside of the box, so to speak.
Yeah.
Gave us kind of the idea of like, oh, we don't have to be so stringent in how these rooms are designed and stuff like that. So
and you only had 5 arrows.
Yeah.
Like you had a finite amount of ammo, which becomes like that's almost a staple in most survival horror games.
Yeah, limited supplies.
Yeah. So it's kind of neat. We watched a couple playthroughs. I mean, it's not super exciting.
No.
But I'm sure for 73, it is probably
fairly entertaining for like a few playthroughs and stuff.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because like it looks like it's been redone a few times, and there is some graphical versions out there that seem to work a little bit differently. But the original game seemed to have a little bit more. Like the rooms connecting seem to be a little bit more sort of random almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. Rather than
the graphical ones almost seem to take away from, I think, the fun.
Yeah, because it drew it all out for you. So
yeah, instead of it all being in your mind, or I mean written down.
Yeah, written down in front of you. But let's move on to the next game that we have on our list, and this game was from the early '80s, for the Atari 2600. It came out in February 1982, and its name is Haunted House. And this game's actually kind of fun. You're a set of eyes in a house, and each of the areas or rooms and floors they look identical, but they're different colors to signify where you are, and there's a number associated with them. And you move around in the dark basically.
Yep.
You start off with 9 lives, and you have different obstacles. There's a bat, a spider, and a ghost, and you have to basically move around to collect 3 pieces of the urn in the house in order to get out of the house with this full urn. And that's the full objective. And what's interesting about this is the game actually also has like different difficulty settings that you can set. Like a game, there's 9 different difficulty settings. And like you can't find the objects unless you use the candle that you have or the lighter or whatever.
Yeah, and you have to like it's matches, and they keep blowing out.
Yeah.
Like they only last a certain amount of time.
Yeah, so you're constantly pressing the action button to like relight it.
If a monster shows up, it automatically blows out your match. So
Yeah,
now
whenever you enter
everything's
that room.
dark. And you can only hold one item at a time.
Yeah.
So you have like collecting pieces of the urn. But if you want to, like, there's a
key
scepter
as well. Yeah.
that keeps the monsters away. You'd have to drop everything to carry that. So it's a lot of backtracking.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was kind of interesting because like at the highest difficulty setting, you didn't even see the walls. It was just your eyes moving around.
Yeah.
And you would see the walls if you lit up the little tiny area around yourself with your matches, which made the game a lot more difficult. And it's kind of neat because, like, in the retrospect in the games that we play now, that in this the survival horror genre, mainly the horror games, you don't always see where you're going.
Yeah.
Right? And this was kind of like one of the first early examples into accomplishing that idea of not being able to see where you are, and then all of a sudden, like, oh, there's a ghost in front of you, right? And like that's not necessarily going to jump scare you on the Atari.
I mean, maybe,
But,
right? Like, this is, again, we're back in 82. Things are a little bit different.
True, but it's kind of interesting as a precursor to the almost hide and seek style of game that and mechanics that we see in today's games. Yeah. But if you know what you're doing, it is kind of short. But horror games are kind of short. So
That's true. I mean, a horror game's not something you want to spend like 70 hours in.
yeah, yeah.
You can only be scared for so long, JC. And then you got to give yourself a break.
Yep, you got to give yourself a break. But let's go on to the next game. Do you want to go into that one?
Absolutely. This is one that I really enjoy.
Yeah.
For multiple reasons. And it is Maniac Mansion, which was a PC game from
1987.
1987.
Yeah, it was originally released on the Commodore 64 and then ported over to various like PCs and like.
I think it's been remade.
There's a remake of it, yeah, that's available on GOG.
Yeah. And there's a sequel. The sequel's been remade. It even had a TV show that went 3 seasons. Canadian TV show that went 3 seasons.
Yeah.
Because it was written by Eugene Levy, of all people. And I remember that show. But yeah, Maniac Mansion was one of the first, I guess it was the first LucasArts adventure games.
Yep.
Made by Ron Gilbert, who did probably some of my favorite games from when I was a kid, like Monkey Island, the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Full Throttle.
Yeah, because all those games use what's known as the SCUM engine, and what it actually stands for is Script Creation Utility for Maniac Mansion. And if you've played any of these LucasArts adventure games, all of them use this game engine, save for Grim Fandango and Escape from Monkey Island, which, like, looking at those 2 games, like they look very different.
Yeah, they really broke away from the classic formula, but like they're
made much later too. So
like if you look at this plays like pretty much everything that
Mhm.
they did adventure game wise.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, new features as time goes on and stuff like that and whatnot, obviously. But yeah.
because it was all point and click. So
Mhm.
you would, you had, I think, 15 options um, that you could like select, whether it was like move to or unlock or look,
Mhm.
and then you'd click on something in the environment,
Right.
and your character would interact with it.
Mhm.
So I mean, this is like of the everything on the list, this is probably the least horrifying because
Yeah, because it's more lighthearted as well.
yeah, I mean they used like a lot of the like horror tropes and B movie um
Influences.
yeah, to kind of tell like a bit of a comedy story.
Right.
Um but I mean you still have that element of, I guess, fear, because the residents of the house are all hostile towards you and
Yeah.
will probably kill you or throw you in the dungeon
Yep.
if they encounter you.
Or your friends.
Or your friends. Yeah, so that's the basis of the story is you are
Dave.
Dave and trying to rescue your girlfriend Sandy Pants
Yep.
from a maniac mansion inhabited by Dr. Fred, his wife Edna the nurse, and their son Weird Ed,
Mhm.
as well as there's two tentacles that live in the house, which they get their own game later. But
Yeah.
yeah, you have these two like sentient tentacles that are human sized, which the green one I believe is somewhat friendly. I don't think the green one's hostile. Like I don't think he'll kill you immediately, but the purple one's not friendly. So yeah, you're trying to avoid these guys while rescuing your girlfriend. When you start the game, you have to enlist two of your friends
Mhm.
of six potential. And I think what's interesting about that is each of them will have different traits. Whereas I want to say Sid can play musical instruments,
Okay.
and I think it was Bernard could fix appliances. Like they all sound like kind of mundane things,
Right.
but they would have something that would be usable to solve a puzzle later on.
Yeah.
And if you didn't have that person with you, you had to like figure out a different way.
Yeah, I think that was like the thing I found most fascinating about this game is that it had multiple paths to basically play through it. And with your friend selection at the beginning of who you're going to take into the mansion to help save Sandy Pants, because of what you were mentioning, you might not be able to solve the one puzzle that's in a certain room because you don't have the guy who can fix appliances, for example, and you'll have to
Yeah.
go figure out another way to do it. So it led to multiple different ways to beat the game, and retrospectively allowed for multiple like different unique playthroughs, which
Yeah, you
brought
had
you back to the game.
you had it. I think it was 5 different endings to this game, and it was all based on like who you took with you, the stuff that you accomplished in the mansion. Because
Hmm.
obviously, if you took the guy who can fix fridges and you needed to like play a guitar,
Right.
well, yeah, you had to skip that or figure out a way around it. So you would have incomplete things essentially.
Yeah.
So it's like the stuff that you completed, and then who survived, because if or if your initial party dies,
Hmm.
you get to take more people in.
Oh, okay.
Like you just
I don't remember.
you get to keep on going. So there's endings based on all that stuff.
Yeah.
So it's kind of neat that they actually had multiple playthroughs
Hmm.
for something that of the time, like the point and click, I guess, genre
Yeah.
was pretty big, and a lot of them don't have multiple endings.
Hmm.
A lot of them are just telling a story,
Yeah.
which you're following from point A to point B.
Yeah, for
Whereas
sure.
this had various different places to end up in,
Yeah.
which, I mean, genre-wise, if you look at a lot of horror stuff,
Or even like adventure games, like most of the Sierra, a lot of the Sierra games have a very linear story.
yeah, but I mean, if you look at a lot of horror stuff that we see now,
Hmm.
there's a good portion of it that will have multiple endings based on decisions and things that you did throughout the game.
Right.
So it's just it's a neat little aspect
Yeah.
that we got early on.
Hmm.
Again, I mean, Maniac Mansion isn't terrifying,
No.
but it's for sure worth playing.
Yeah.
Like, it's definitely worth your time.
And one of the really other cool aspects of this game was its use of cutscenes.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, they use it in order to basically tell the story and progress it. Informing the player about things that are happening like on screen or off screen. And it's one of the earliest examples of a game where that actually affected the gameplay itself. Ron Gilbert actually helped coin the phrase cutscene in the use of video games because of this. Because like before, like the only like real cutscenes that you would see would be like, for example, like Pac-Man at the very beginning intro board. You would see like Pac-Man like going across the screen and then being chased by ghosts, or like Donkey Kong taking Penelope and then climbing up his tower,
And then, like, stomping the...
Yeah, and then the game begins, right? Like, those were, like, really simple cutscenes, but they didn't really refer to them as cutscenes until
Whereas,
Ron Gilbert's
like,
contribution.
this kind of felt like a lot of the stuff was almost timed.
Mm-hmm.
Like, once you'd been in the house for, like, X amount of minutes, if you hadn't done, like, thing A or B,
Right.
this event was going to happen somewhere else in the house.
Yeah.
And it would show you that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you would know, okay, like, person A is in this section of the house.
Yeah.
So you could try to avoid that if you knew where that room happened to be. So no, it's a really cool game. If you have a point, like I said, there's various remakes. I think the sequel you can get on pretty much everything now. Day of the Tentacle, that's remade and available everywhere.
Yeah, which is kind of like a standalone remake.
Yeah.
Or sorry, standalone sequel, I should say.
Yes. Yeah, because it's still similar gameplay and a unique story. You didn't need to know all the ins and outs of what happened in episode 1, I guess.
Yeah. Let's go on to the next game. The next game that we wanted to talk about was Splatterhouse. And this is a game that came out in 1988 for the arcade and subsequently for the TurboGrafx 16 in 1990. And this game is a beat-em-up game, basically.
Yeah.
A lot of these games are kind of like horror themed rather than like actually being scary, but
it's true. Yeah. And again, it's I guess a product of the era.
Yeah, and it's a theme too, right? It's not necessarily the fact that it's going to necessarily scare you, but it's But in this game, you play as this guy named Rick. Not that it's overly super important. But,
he's a parapsychologist.
Yep.
It is super important.
It is super important to the story. And you basically go through various different designed side-scrolling stages, and the game's stages borrow very heavily from Western horror films. Specifically, you can see a lot of influences from The Evil Dead and Friday the 13th.
I mean, he's basically Jason. He's just like a super jacked version of Jason, where he's wandering through a house, beating up a lot of elements from the Evil Dead movies, or Evil Dead 2 specifically. I mean, a lot of the story of the first game specifically is very much Evil Dead 2.
Yeah.
You know, you're trying to I mean, when you when you look at the story on paper, it doesn't sound like it, but when you actually like sit down and play it, there's a lot of things where you're like, yeah, that's from Evil Dead 2. Oh, that is as well. Oh, same with that. Because I mean, you're two like a boyfriend and girlfriend that go into a house, which is referred to as the Splatter House. I believe it's West Mansion. And as soon as you get in the front door, your girlfriend Jennifer screams, and Roy gets knocked out and wakes up in the basement, I believe dead, but brought back to life by the Terror Mask, or Hell Mask, depending on the censorship of the version that you're playing. And the mask like just tells you to tear your way through the house to find your girlfriend. Yeah. So it's like none of that really sounds like it would be similar to Evil Dead, but when you're playing it, man, it's
very similar.
There's so much Evil Dead, but it's a really like good side-scrolling beat 'em up, because you have that like your punch, you've got a kick, you have a low punch and a low kick, and then you've got items to pick up throughout the levels as well, which I found the items to be some of the most satisfying. I mean, when you're walking through that first level with a 2x4 smacking like some kind of ghoul or demon into the background.
Yeah, that was
like
always cool.
they're walking forward and you just like
you hit them right into the background. It was kind of like the opposite of what Turtles in Time did, where you hit the foot soldiers towards the screen and you were hitting them into the wall at the background.
Yeah, it's just like splat against the wall. It was great.
Yeah.
And satisfying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can definitely tell that the game designers really loved and enjoyed Western horror films. But yeah, the game's got 6 stages in total, with a kind of final boss section for sort of like there's a couple areas where it's just like an area which is a final boss, but the game also includes kind of like a few multiple pathways where if like you fall down a hole you can keep on going and then like climb back up through a ladder, like if you accidentally fell down that hole, for example. And it was kind of interesting because you don't necessarily have to take 100% the same path, but it more or less in this game ends up being the same path anyway.
It kind of is.
Just like a kind of like miniature sub path. It's like, oh, I fell down here for a little bit and I got to climb back up or whatever. But
it's basically once you get, I want to say it's past like, because the first level is the dungeon. Mm-hmm. So I mean, you can't really go down from the dungeon. And there's one level that is an exterior.
Yeah. But
from that point on, like when you're in the mansion, yeah, you can fall down to another floor in the mansion. Mm-hmm. Like it's, yeah, I like that it's not just like you fall in a pit and die.
Yeah,
it's you fall in a pit and okay, you're on this stage now.
Yeah,
get back to where you were before.
Yeah,
so there's a lot of cool things, and like you said, that this isn't really terrifying. It really is more the aesthetic of it. Mm-hmm. And borrowing from a lot of influences, especially from like Western horror influences, because that's kind of a neat thing to see from Japan, because this is a Japanese game.
Yeah.
And yeah, it didn't even have, I guess, major release over here because the TurboGrafx 16 wasn't a huge console in North America.
Yeah, although this is generally cited as one of the like top 10 TurboGrafx 16 games released in North America.
I mean, when you have 15 games.
There's a lot more than 15 games, but anyway. Yeah. The last thing I'd like to mention about this game, which is kind of cool, that it uses is a method to discourage credit feeding, basically. And what credit feeding is basically if you played an arcade game and you've ever beaten it, you potentially may have only beaten it because you put in enough money.
Okay, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And then so, I mean, that's how I beat House of the Dead for the first time.
Me too.
So it's like, can I have $20 in quarters? What? Anyway, yeah, basically what it did was instead of whenever you died and started over, and you wouldn't start right where you were, you would go back to a checkpoint that was set, and then you'd have to actually like get good and then be able to make it through the majority of the level, rather than just like, oh, I ran out of lives at the boss, just put in another coin and then I can like try and keep trying again. And they wanted to discourage that, so they added in that feature to the game, and I just find that interesting because there are quite a few games that do use that and don't use that. I think it really depends on the game, but this is a game that I've seen used in a lot of shoot 'em ups where there's no credit feeding for like 90% of the game except for like the last level, for example. And this isn't all shoot 'em ups; it's just some of them. And then the last one, if you can't actually beat the entire level without like beating it, like truthfully, it doesn't even port you halfway through. It goes all the way back to the start, and that was kind of a common thing with some like Neo Geo Cab shoot 'em ups and stuff like that. Just to try and get you to actually be able to beat the game and want to come back rather than just downing $5 in quarters and being able to beat it. So yeah, those are some of the video games from early history. From the 70s and 80s that use the horror genre, and
kind of the precursors of I guess horror now.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of them had element, like we mentioned, a lot of them have elements that we see in stuff. I mean, there are way more games from like I guess 90 on that are incredibly more influenced to the genre
Yeah,
and to the gameplay that we see now.
especially with more and more games being built as like the decades move on.
But you can, looking back at these, you can really see the building blocks and the pathways that people have taken to get to the point where we are now.
Yeah,
I wouldn't necessarily suggest going back and playing all of them.
maybe Splatterhouse.
So, and Maniac Mansion.
Yeah, those
Those
are
two for sure.
The two of them from our list that
They definitely both stand up. But on that, we did have some recommendations for some, I guess, classic horror. The stipulation that we kind of put on ourselves was nothing past 1995. Because if you look, which maybe you will, from that point on, there was a lot of things that were like hugely influential and just big things for the genre. There is one you will note that is missing. If you know what it is, throw it in the comments, and I'll give you one of these and be impressed. But JC, what was your first recommendation?
The first game that I wanted to go over was Darkseed, which is a PC game that came out in 1992, and there's also various other ports. Some of the ports, like the PlayStation and the Saturn version, were only released in Japan, but what's interesting about those ports is that the dialogue that's spoken is still in English, but the actual text is in Japanese, for example. Neat. So it's still semi-playable for a North American audience, but the original PC port is... released in North America. And yeah, so this game is kind of interesting, especially since the game features the art of H.R. Geiger. And if you don't know who that is, that's the guy who did the stylized xenomorph aliens and like spaceships and stuff like that in the Alien movie.
Yeah, if you're at work, do not look up the art of H.R. Geiger, because it is a lot of genitals. A lot of genitals. Just a side note, but that's really cool. I didn't actually know about this. So what's the gameplay loop like?
So it's a point and click adventure game where you basically play as an author whose name is Mike Dawson, and he recently purchased a mansion, and the game starts off with him like going like into the mansion, then he like spends the first night there, and it takes a course over 3 days. And on that first night, he actually has a nightmare about how the previous owner was killed. And the next morning, while getting ready for his day, he basically finds clues that link his dream and the actual murder. And it actually reveals a parallel universe that's called the Dark World in the game, which is actually ruled by these aliens called the Ancient Ones, I think, or the Ancient Beings. And so basically the game's relatively short, so to speak, because it only takes course over 3 days. But its key gameplay aspect is actually that you actually are timed on solving what you need to do in each of the days. So there's a lot of replaying the game, basically. Because if you don't solve certain things fast enough, then basically you'll get into a state where it's actually unbeatable. I'm pretty sure this is why I never beat this as a kid, because I didn't realize that's what was going on. And I eventually just kind of put this down. But it was pretty cool in the respect that, there'd be like this dark world and the real world, and you kind of like there was different aspects that happen in either of them, and so it's just kind of interesting that it was kind of like a totally different way of looking at the game, where it was like, we're not going to make like this long linear adventure, we're going to make like this shorter adventure, and we're just going to make it a little bit harder to beat, and not by just making the puzzles necessarily impossible, but just like, you have 2 minutes to figure out how to solve this puzzle. Or I think it was a little bit longer than that, but and then you got to go to the next section and do that, and then go to the next section and do that. So it kind of puts some stress on you, so to speak. And it's using that like art style of H.R. Geiger. It's like using the Alien franchise, as I mentioned, and it's just a really cool, like the entire Dark World looks like that. So it's pretty neat. Your first choice, Ian?
It's Doom. what I found most interesting about Doom, especially as a kid, I probably shouldn't have been playing Doom as a kid, but I'd played Wolfenstein previously, and Wolfenstein,
So this was okay.
yeah, exactly. That's the logic.
Yep.
I'd played worse, so yeah, like Wolfenstein is kind of tense,
Mm-hmm.
but people can only be so scary. The various like hell beasts were terrifying.
Yeah.
Like the imps, like they scared me so much as a kid. I
I found
was
this game
freaked
super
right out playing
stressful
Doom. Yeah,
because with all the creatures and monsters, it kind of gave a little bit of like reality to your like in impending doom, so to speak, because like they were
yeah.
coming towards you constantly and just throwing fireballs at you. And it's like holy crap, and it's like all in 3 dimensions and stuff like that.
And you
Which
had those big pink things. I can't remember what they're called, but they would like charge at you, and
Mhm.
then when you got into further levels, they were invisible.
Yeah.
Those were terrifying, and you could hear them,
Hmm.
but you couldn't see it.
Yeah.
Like you could maybe see the like shadow because it had a little bit
Yeah,
of
there's
a.
an outline of them,
But
but if there was a lot of creatures on the screen, it was hard
no,
to see.
and then like you just had bigger and more frightening things,
Mhm.
and yeah, I think the first Doom still stands up as something that is, I'm not gonna say terrifying,
Right.
but it'll give you a little bit of a scare occasionally. You open a door, something's right there. Might
If
give you a little
nothing
start.
else, it'll definitely stress you out a little bit by the number of monsters that are on the screen.
Exactly.
Or at least it'll be excitable because it'll be like, yeah, I'm killing all these demons. Yeah.
You had another one, JC?
Yeah, so this is another point-and-click adventure game, and this is Gabrielle Knight's Sins of the Fathers. It was released in 1993 by Sierra, and the game is actually based off of a film called Angel Heart, which was released in 1987, which is subsequently based off of a book that came out in 1978, 10 years earlier than the movie, called Falling Angel. And in this game,
Okay.
you're owner of a rare bookstore, Gabrielle Knight, who's actually voiced by Tim Curry. And the cool aspect of this game is a lot of it is voice acted.
Okay.
I think all of it actually, if I recall correctly. Or maybe the original version doesn't have all the voice acting, but the remake does.
Because old Gabe has like 4 or 5 games, doesn't he?
Yeah, this is an entire series.
Yeah, there's
I
a
think 4 of them in a remake.
and this is the first one.
Yeah, the very first one. Yeah,
That's
that's
pretty
the
cool.
one that I've played. So, it basically what's happening is Gabriel is investigating some local murders, and he actually plans to use the murders from his notes and investigation for the basis of a book that he's working on. And the game basically takes place over a series of days, and it's fairly linear. But in respects that the game itself is kind of like overall linear, but the days themselves are kind of, you can do the various tasks in any order that you want. Once all the tasks have been completed for that day, then the story will move on to the next game, where you get like the characters talking in the narration and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't want to go into the game too much, but and it's been a really long time since I played this game. Probably like I was a teenager whenever I was playing this. So
I mean, just a couple years ago.
yeah, a couple years ago. But yeah, so the game was kind of interesting in the respect that the main story was fairly linear, but like how you did each day was you could complete in any order. And yeah, it's similar to many of the other 90s action adventure games, and specifically the point and click adventure games by Sierra, being the same publisher. But yeah, it was a really interesting story, and really great writing, and has quite a few actual voice actors in the game that you probably will recognize. So Tim Curry being one of them. And yeah, that's my second recommendation for an early horror game. Your second one?
Okay, this is going to be a controversial opinion, but Friday the 13th for the NES.
Okay.
I know that this is a bad game. I know that. But
I've heard this is a bad game, but I've never actually played it. Never had access to it.
so as a young child, this was one of the games that I owned. I
Oh,
owned
okay.
this game, and yeah, I would throw it in and play it. I don't know how I had this game. I have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Maybe I got it at a garage sale or something, and my parents weren't looking.
Right.
No clue. But I owned it,
Right.
and yeah, I would play it, and I had no idea what was going on. But I was always afraid. And then eventually you would end up in the random hut that has Jason in it, and he'd be there, and I'm like, and like scared, and you're running away, and the music was kind of creepy, and yeah, it's a bad game. It is a bad game, but for me it really, like, I don't know,
Stuck in your mind.
it creeped out 6-year-old Ian. 6-year-old, I don't know. However old I was at that point, I was probably pretty young. I was way too young to be playing this game. But it creeped me right out. And I think I'd recently seen maybe Jason Takes Manhattan. Again, I probably shouldn't have seen that. But yeah, it was scary. So it scared young me. Would it scare me now? Probably not.
Mm-hmm.
Man, that's a bad recommendation. You know what? Okay, do yourself a favor. I'm not going to go into depth about it because we are going to talk about it way later. But find yourself an English translation of Sweet Home. Give that a go. That's my recommendation.
Yeah.
You want to play something cool? We're going to talk about it in a later episode. Sweet Home.
Fair enough. Cool. Redeems your bad recommendation, I think. But those are our recommendations and a little bit of history of some of the early video games in the horror genre. And so let us know down in the comments down below.
What's your favorite old horror game?
Yeah.
What's your favorite old horror game?
Yeah. Try and keep it 95 or up to 90.
Up to 95. It's going to be harder than you think.
Yeah, it's going to be harder than you think. Because we were like, oh, we should do like this game or that game, but we're like, we're...
And like I said, there is for sure one that was in the early 90s that we didn't mention. We are going to do a short episode on it later because it's super important.
Yeah.
But having to skip over that one, it's quite challenging.
Yeah.
So let us know. And if you like this video, make sure to give us a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't to keep getting more content from us. Mm-hmm. And we will see you
in the next episode.
Absolutely.